Hello, today we're going over Chapter 9 of the fourth edition of Grammar of the Edit. I'm not going to go over Chapter 8 necessarily because it's like over 100 pages, and in Chapter 8 they're going over some best practices, and there's 60 different points, so I usually like to assign that anyways to you to read over that content and then post about it either in discussions or either in class. So we'll have an assignment, something similar to that for Chapter 8. So this is why today it's only Chapter 9, and this is the final chapter for Grammar of the Edit. So congratulations, you finished the text, or at least you got through all the lectures. So good for you. So we're going to go through Chapter 9, and so this should be a little bit shorter than the previous lectures. All right, let's go ahead and go to Google and share. All right, so here's Chapter 9, and the Chapter 9 too. While Chapter 8 is gives you 60 sort of tips, roughly, and best practices, Chapter 9 is kind of a summation in a way. It's sort of like kind of a comeback. Okay, now that we've given you all of these things, or in Chapter 8, we've given you all of these things to think about, which is a lot of stuff. And usually, I know when I'm coming out of Chapter 8, you're usually kind of like, whoa, it's a lot of stuff. I think Chapter 9 kind of pulls back and says, we did give you all this stuff. And that's sort of the thorough lessons, things that to keep in mind. But Chapter 9 kind of is like, you're not always going to remember everything, sure, but at the very least, take these suggestions here and these in a way, these best practices, and at the very least utilize these, and inside of a lot of these or these 15 or so takeaways, there will be some nuggets of some of the bigger or some of Chapter 8 stuff. It's just in a lot more detail. So let's go ahead and start talking about key takeaways especially for new editors, because that's who this book is for. It's for some people who are just starting off. Things to think about. So as we're making content, editing, we have to remember that sound and vision are partners, especially with editing. Editing typically we just talk about the visuals, or the sound is an afterthought or something to cut to, but we should think of them as equal. And just kind of in general for most let's say most content that is or at least most of the stuff that we'll be cutting, we got to take both things into consideration. One of my favorite breakdowns when I talk about video and audio is to remind everyone that video is 20% of the project and audio is actually like 80% of the project. And it's like, that's a huge breakdown, and it's true because audiences will forgive poor video as long as the audio is good. But audiences rarely will forgive your work if your video looks great, but the audio is bad. That's just called being a YouTuber for the most part, because that's, a lot of that stuff out there is recorded with just onboard mics from smart devices or cameras, and you can tell it sounds terrible. So that's why we practice using microphones, and we want to make sure that we understand how to use the audio correctly. So eyesight and hearing, to our point, they both evolve together, and they inform our human environments. You might hear my cat here. Yeah, they inform human environments, or at least the spaces around us. If the audience sees and hears something on the screen, they're more likely to go along with the story, more willing to accept what they're seeing. However, if one or the other is severely deficient, it will take away from the experience. I did mention that bad audio will supersede good video. And I will say that one exception is there are instances where the video may not be the best, but the audio is good. And we see that a lot too. And when we're looking at archived film, that was shot, 50 years ago. I mean, any film that was shot over 40, 50 years ago, it's older, but usually the audio is all right, and that's why I think we can accept it. A new shot, when we're doing cuts now we're talking about technique. When we're cutting, keep that in mind. A new shot should contain new information. That's sort of the philosophy that we should think of, like, especially when we're thinking like, should I cut here or not? That's a good sort of first instinct to have. Is like, is what we're going to be cutting to Uh, One, is it necessary, and is it going to give us new information? You know, those are the kinds of things we want to think about. Every time a new editor makes a new cut, should be for a reason. Editing for the sake of editing can become tiresome. It does, it can weigh on a person's sort of, you know, uh, let's say, mental energy in a way. Um, it can confuse people, and then for some it's just boring, you know. It can be an inefficient way of editing, you know, just to cut for the sake of cutting, or maybe we are insecure. That's another thing to think about. I know for many young filmmakers and young editors, you just feel insecure to let your content play out because you think, well, it's got to be cut, because no one just wants to sit there and watch, you know, the film unfold. But you know, it's got to be for a reason. So don't just cut just because you think you should cut, but you know, and if you think that it might be too boring, then you might want to rethink what you're making. Should be a reason for every edit. Should be a reason. If a shot has a complete beginning, middle, and end, it doesn't necessarily, you know, make a cut or need a cut. You know, it doesn't need one. Perfect example is Akira Kurosawa, the director, writer of Seven Samurai. He's one of the few filmmakers out there that does direct and edit his own films. But that's also one thing I think many people fail to mention, is that he is editing. He is editing his own films. I don't recall having that aspect of his workflow being part of my initial education. It's just something that I came onto when I was studying his work. Kurosawa, though, because of how he approached film and the fact that he was a director editor, I think very similar even to Hitchcock, who had editing in mind when he was directing, because he shot the way he wanted it cut, you know, and you can usually tell, you know, with the directors and editors, especially in their working relationships. The thing with Kurosawa, he is responsible for the visual style of a lot of Hollywood, modern Hollywood films, because he knew how to tell a story visually. So again, that also makes it easy to teach him in film school. Do young filmmakers take those lessons? Some do, some don't. Because I still don't. I'm not completely convinced that you know, filmmakers, you know, modern filmmakers aren't completely sold on visual storytelling, because you know, they rely so much on dialogue and telling versus showing. But you can kind of see there are a few filmmakers, especially the indie scene, that understand how to visually tell a story. One thing to consider, if an actor has a monologue, you can use sometimes a reaction shot from some of your other actors on the set to break up the continuity, and sometimes that does provide new information, or even helps align the viewer with that other person to kind of get them into the story, or get them into that speech. One notable exemption from this does come from Kurosawa. It does come from Seven Samurai. It's about the middle of the show, where Kikuchito, the Seventh Samurai, delivers a very stunning dialogue, or monologue, excuse me, where he discusses the plight of the poor farmers and why they are distrusting of the samurai. A very powerful moment, but one that many people have, or critics especially and historians, have taken to that scene as Kurosawa's way of speaking to Japanese audiences in general, and kind of in speaking his mind regarding certain aspects of you know, Western colonialism and Japanese attitudes towards that. Keep in mind that every time we get to an edit, we should justify an edit. Every edit should be justified. There should be a reason for it. So let's take a look at these next few points. Pacing should have a purpose. Fast cutting, where an edit occurs every 3 seconds, has been kind of typical today. It's been a staple in action films, and recently utilized, I would say at least in the last 30, 40 years. A lot of that influence comes from MTV and music videos. The heavy music videos of the last 25 years, or at least from 1980 till I would say around 2005, because we really haven't seen too many music videos on MTV lately. But we have to be just wary of that kind of editing. I always talk about Transformers, and as an example of editing that just kind of gives you a headache. I mean, the Transformer films in general, I mean, when you watch those on the big screen, they can give you a headache. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on, lots of visual information, and it becomes tiresome. I mean, that's why sometimes you'll walk out of a theater and you'll be like, God, I feel exhausted. I just sat there and watched the movie, but I want to go take a nap. Yeah, there's a reason. It's because your mind was processing and trying to keep track of everything they were seeing on screen. So it's not like watching a movie isn't completely passive. It's not. It's very active. You're engaged. And I know when I watch a really great film, like right now, I'm kind of going over a lot of Jean-Luc Godard's catalog. Some for the first time and a lot on repeat, but this time taking serious study of it. You as you watch it, you get ideas, and you start to make associations, and especially when you watch with a critical eye. So it is an active engagement. Observe the action line. So this is I mentioned this in one of the previous lectures as when we talk about the action line. This is also one way that we can tell the difference between experienced filmmakers and filmmakers that are just starting off, because they will break that line. They will cross that line. Remember, the line is the axis of action, where we place our actors, where we have them, we block them into that space, and then we kind of draw a half circle around them, and we set up our camera around that, especially if we're talking about dialogue shots. It's that 180-degree arc. Now, the imaginary line cuts through the area of action, just as I mentioned, along talent sight lines. So where the talent would be sitting, looking at each other. These are the sight lines. Or this can also be something that follows in the direction of screen movement, or the way objects are moving, again, for continuity. Remember, that action line is that basis for that 180-degree line. So I'm just following the notes here. That's that line. Look over one of the previous chapters to get a look at that. However, we will have example here. The idea is then you move around that line when you have a setup. So if you're shooting someone, if I'm going to make a cut based on that line, remember, I got to move at least 30 degrees so it looks like I'm on a different setup, so it doesn't just appear like it's a cut, like a jump cut. Especially if it's not necessary. Remember, every cut to it, and especially if you're cutting to either another angle or a minor angle, it's got to be there for a reason. One of the films that when we talk about that kind of angle cutting and sort of making sure that it's it's different enough, is even in that very famous scene that we study over and over, the psycho shower death scene. There are even scenes in there where it appears like, wait, we just cut and we just had this minor change. And what Hitchcock does in some of those cuts is he changes the focal length. So we go from like wide angle lenses to telephoto lenses, and it looks like, and we can tell because most of the screen's in focus on the wide and we can see the environment. But then when we move to that telephoto, only the actor's in focus, and the space in front of her and behind her is slightly out of focus. And that kind of helps to isolate her from what's about to happen, which is the murder. So again, there's a reason for that change in focal length, just to reinforce the character's environment and maybe what's going to happen to them. So let's take a look at another example of like, let's say a two shot, and there's that line of axis right there in the middle between A and B, and here's that camera. And here's an example of doing it properly. So like if we want to get a close-up of our actor on the left side, so the woman wearing the dress with the sleeves here, we see that the camera is still within this line of axis. So it's still closer. It's to the south, if you will, of the line. Because when we break the line, let's say we go north of it and we cross the action line, here's an example of what could happen. Then what happens with our actor? So here's our other actor with the collared shirt and the black shirt versus the light shirt. See, when we cross the line, then it appears like they're both standing in the same place, even though they're not. So it looks like they're both talking in the same direction and not necessarily talking to each other, as we're made to be seen here, or as is the reality. So we don't want this to happen. Again, there are instances where this rule is broken. The best example is Raging Bull, but that does happen in camera. There is no cut; it's more of a swish pan. That is used though by Scorsese to emphasize the sort of chaos of boxing. So keep in mind who did it. That was Martin Scorsese. At this point, he's already been making films almost for 10 years and has already made Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore. He's already made Who's That Knocking at My Door, Mean Streets, Taxi Driver. So he's already made some amazing films. And if he stopped at Raging Bull, I mean, we would still be talking about him because those films were very, very impactful. So again, know the rules before you can break them, but you have to know the rules. Let's continue. So when we're looking at some two shots, we got to think about, you know, one, getting the appropriate form of edit, and also think about why some shots may not work. So things to consider. Maybe the angle is wrong, right? One is too high, one's too low, and that would mean the eye lines wouldn't match each other. So it wouldn't appear like the people are speaking. Maybe one's like this and the other one's like this. And it just doesn't look right. You know, it's the imbalance, you know, is discombobulating, and it's just something that we don't see. There are moments where we see it. The one I can think of where that might work, I think one was in the movie Poltergeist, when I don't remember, I think it was the first one, but when when one of the researchers explained to the family what happens with people and their souls, and the little boy Robbie makes a comment about, well, my grandma died or someone died and I was watching her and I didn't see a soul go away. What does that mean? And they said, well, you know, they're invisible. You can't always see them. But I think that's one of the few instances where his eye line doesn't necessarily match the person that's answering him or speaking to him, but he's also in the sort of the bosom of his family and a comfort. So he's in a subordinate position. Again, it's if you're doing that, it's got to be for the purpose of storytelling. But I would recommend right now, at the beginning of your career, just focus on getting or matching eye lines and make sure those match, because we don't want the other stuff to happen yet until you've mastered the proper way of doing it. We always want to make sure that our continuity is correct, because our continuity could be wrong, as you know, also as the angle could be wrong. Sometimes we cut and there is no new information, so it's like, oh, that was a wasted cut. Or we have no motivation, right? The actor doesn't, or the character doesn't give us a reason for the cut. Sometimes the composition is wrong, and that's what I was just explaining and giving you an example from Poltergeist, or a combination of all of those. In a lot of ways, what we're talking about here is just setting up the camera properly, blocking your actors along one of those rule of third lines, and then making sure that, you know, usually on the top third line, that's usually where we put our eyes, where if we have a dialogue scene, that we put both of our speaking actor or character parts on those eye lines, just so that they match. So, I mean, just even keeping that in mind, that's a really great way to kind of start the career. Again, to emphasize good editing practices, good habits. And, you know, we should have those right from the beginning. The next point, the better the edit, the less it's noticed. So that's one of the things that we talk about in terms of editing. Editing usually, or has been referred to as the invisible art, because if it's performed properly or performed well on a show, typically audience members don't notice it. And that's also what comes when you're watching a film, you know, or a TV show, but shows in general. That adds to that, I like this work. It adds to that sort of gut level feeling. And it's not gut level, as we'll see in the next point, because editing is manipulation. It is the editor's job to construct the project from all the pieces that we get, you know, the video, the audio, stills, any motion graphics. So the editor is subordinate to what the overall goal of the project is, because the editor isn't making everything, you know, they're just receiving. So they work with what they have. Therefore, the editor should make that understanding of that project, or that they're subordinate to that project, that should be the driving force behind their work. And the goal is then to make sure that the audience understands what the story is, or that they have the same experience as the editor, that they understand the story, they understand why some of the cuts happen. we did talk a little bit about Soviet montage theory. We talked about like at least some of their points. I did mention some of their other ones as well, but as an overview, Soviet montage theory emphasized the fact that you can control people's emotions through editing. And if you control their emotions, you control their thinking to an extent, because people will always side with their emotional feeling over rational thinking. That's just the way it is. I mean, look at the way that the current administration, I mean, look at politics. That's just what we should think of in general, because who knows when you're watching this. But the thing is, especially with politics, you know, certain types of voters like it when people say, like, I go by my gut, I go with my feeling, you know, I go how I feel. And people say, I like that. And it's like, no, you know, we don't want to go through that. You know, we want rational thinking, you know. But that's exactly what the Soviet montage theory understood, why a lot of their films were considered propaganda, also why the government was in many ways enthusiastic about funding their work, because they knew, you know, if we put out these projects with these filmmakers, it will we can continue our agenda. But then again, you know, some of these filmmakers, you know, start making work with other messages beyond just maybe what they wanted to emphasize. So, you know, they cut the funding and the school died. Now, the role of the assistant editor. For many young editors or people starting out, you work for an experienced editor as their assistant. This requires you to be the person in acquisition. So you're acquiring new footage. You typically will set up the projects. You capture the assets and organize them. So all the videos, the stills, the audios, and you put everything in their structures or their bins with proper naming protocols. And sometimes you even help with the at the end of the show when it's done and edited, you help with the output too, and also how that's organized, make sure it's easy to access. At the same time too, you know, as you're doing that, the assistant editors are also there to maintain the facility and ensure smooth workflows so that the main editor can focus on the storytelling and not worry so much about technical issues. So remember all the problems some of you had. You know, some of you did have a few problems working, but those are all best practices. That is true wisdom. Remember, knowledge and wisdom are tied with experience, and that's the smartest people are people that are wise, or people that have had lots of problems and that remembered the solutions to those problems so they didn't do them again. And then this way they have advice for other people, like, oh yeah, don't do it that way because this will happen, right? It's sort of like when people have good mechanics, it's because they messed up a lot, you know. And that's what I say with editing too. I mean, like I feel like I've reached a certain level in my editing because I've messed up a lot, and also in my production. I messed up a lot in my production. My most current show that I did, my most current documentary, I made a huge error, but we live with them, right? And there's something that sometimes there's always, I mean, it's every show, remember, is unique, and remember, every show will bring its own unique problems. Therefore, we can't discount them, you know, in terms of like, well, that happened on this show because it was this way. You just never know. You just never know. Just know that you probably will have problems, and you must be flexible enough to go with the flow. And hopefully, if you know, when you find the solution to your problem, you won't have it again. Finally, editing is creating. Remember that the editor is technically the last person to edit the screenplay. We're there. We do have the script to look at. We do have all the assets to edit. Hopefully, the production team has everything we need in terms of continuity, or at least to keep the director satisfied in terms of you know, everything they want. And we also want to make sure that the grammar of the show that we're working on is understandable to the audience. Yeah, and also entertaining, right? We want to make it entertaining, based upon always what the needs of that show are, or what, and also what the intended audience is and how it's going to be shown. So we do end this lecture. I still go back to that Marshall McLuhan's statement: the medium is the message. What that means is how or the way that the film is going to be experienced will provide a lot of the technical information for how we're going to film, how we're going to edit, how we're going to show the work. So always keep in mind, like while we're working and we're editing, if we know we're going to be showing this thing like on a smart device, then having, you know, a lot of these master shots where the person's walking like through a desert or through environments, it may not work with that well because they'll be very tiny. It may look better on a tablet and on a computer screen. It might look okay on a 50-inch television, but on anything that's smaller than 10 inches, it could be an issue. So keep all that in mind too. Intended audience and intended viewing. That should also inform your final editing decisions. So we finished the chapter and we finished the book. Lots to consider, but in the end, I think the main point is again, that experience and how we're going to experience the show will dictate a lot of our decisions for how the show should be edited, and also and what we should emphasize, you know, whether we should have a lot more close-ups or a lot more like master shots, you know, or combinations of those things. Now I did put in that point, or the book does talk about the editor being the last person. Of course, we do have review. We do show it to the director. We do show it to the producer in studio, who, unfortunately, we do have to go through now, you know, audience reactions and feedback. So there is also that. So keep in mind, because this is about making a lot of money. But just know that the more money there is, the bigger the show, that the more feedback you're going to get back as an editor. If this is more this is your project with your funding or your grant, then just know that you won't have as much of a pushback in terms of your editing decisions. All right, so I hope you enjoyed this journey. We're finishing up with chapter 9, and with that piece of advice, go break a leg, everyone, and I look forward to seeing your work.